Taylor Ellwood here, and welcome to the Magical Experiments podcast. This week I want to talk about the subject of inner alchemy and shadow work. Are inner alchemy and shadow work the same? I think there is a bit of a conflation that occurs in regards to shadow work and inner alchemy. And so I'm going to unpack what I think the differences are and why it's important to really understand what those differences are instead of conflating the two together. Now, if you're on my YouTube, I invite you to like and comment on this video, and if you're new, go ahead and subscribe. If you're on my Substack, I would really appreciate it if you would heart this video and restack it with a note so you can share it, and of course, feel free to leave a comment. So, I don't think that inner alchemy and shadow work are the same. And I think it's really important to understand that shadow work is something that really is a terminology and a concept that has come out of Jungian psychology. Now, Jung did a lot of work around alchemy, but he was essentially psychologizing alchemy and trying to turn it into psychological concepts, which is not accurate either. And I want to be very clear here that when I talk about inner alchemy, I'm not necessarily talking about laboratory alchemy, which is a very different... There are components of inner alchemy within laboratory alchemy, but laboratory alchemy, you definitely have a space where you are actively creating and refining substances using alchemical principles. And there's an inner alchemical component to it. I've done a little bit of laboratory alchemy, not a lot, and I mean, I would say that I don't have a lot of experience with it. I have worked with and talked with people who are alchemists who've done the work, and I've seen what they do, and it's really fascinating and interesting. It's also time-consuming and expensive. And it's one of those cases where, at least in my particular case, I know I'll never get around to doing it. I mean, there's just too many other things I want to explore. So I'm glad there are alchemists out there. But you can also practice inner alchemy without necessarily doing laboratory alchemy, and I'm going to get into that. But let's circle back around here to the the topic at hand. So shadow work is really based out of Jungian psychology, and the idea is that we're going to explore our shadows, the unconscious parts of ourselves that we're not paying attention to, or that we are acting out from, but that we're not consciously aware of. It's those parts of ourselves where we're acting from a place of sabotage. The most important thing that I can say about this really is that it is very much a psychological concept, and it has some valid importance in terms of doing inner work. Like when I go and I do men's work, for example, one of the things we end up talking about is like finding our shadow and our gold. And one of the things is that, underneath the shadow is the gold, like, because you're looking at the areas of your life where you're operating from shadow. So if I'm acting from a place where I'm out of integrity with myself, then I'm operating from shadow. Or if I've made an agreement with somebody, and I am not fully operating from a place of integrity, then that's going to be a place where I'm operating out of shadow, and I need to own that and recognize it. And in magical work or spiritual work, we see this term shadow work bandied around a lot. And again, it is basically a terminology for doing inner work. But it's doing it under a very specific context. And what I would share with you is that, there's definitely a space for doing shadow work. I think that that space is best done, or that work is best done with a therapist or with a coach that is trauma informed, because a lot of times we're going to be or in a support group where there are people there who understand like the work, and they're able to support you in that work. And being a trauma informed coach and a also someone who helps facilitate inner work in group settings, I mean, I definitely can help people with that, and I do. That's part of my work as a men's coach, and it's also work that I extend to beyond just men. I mean, if a woman wants to work with me, I'm more than happy to work with her, or a non-binary person. But it's essential that you understand that. I mean, you can do it on your own to some degree, and I say this as someone who's done a fair amount of inner work over the years. But there is something to be said for doing this work with other people, because they're going to be able to spot your blind spots better than you are. After all, you've been living with those blind spots, and in a very real sense, that's what shadow work is about. It's about discovering the blind spots in our lives and then pulling the shadow out and taking a look at it and finding the gold within. It's about discovering, like, well, okay, I'm sabotaging myself this way. I'll use a personal example. My personal example would be recognizing the way that I sabotaged and undermined relationships that I've had in the past because I was operating from a place of trying to get their approval, and at the same time wanting them to meet my needs and desires without being honest about those needs and desires. So I was operating from a place of covert contracts where it's like, okay, if I do these activities such as mowing the lawn, taking out the trash, etc., then you're going to want to be intimate with me. Well, aside from the fact that that's a really transactional approach to a relationship, it was also based on an unspoken agreement that said the other person didn't necessarily know that agreement was in place, but I had that expectation. That's operating from shadow. And so being able to pull that out and explore that and see like my codependent behaviors and where I was like projecting stuff onto somebody, that was huge. And and it's ongoing work in our lives. I mean, there's always going to be a part of me that has to look very carefully at like what I do and what I choose to do and why, and really examine it and question it very carefully. So I share that so that that you understand that this isn't something where you just get it figured out all instantly. Now you can do a lot of work to change things. Like what I did is I went through a period of time here recently in the last 4 months where I went through 6 initiatory experiences, and those experiences were continually helping to reset me and to prime the pump toward making some very specific changes so that I would be a different person out on the other side. And I'm definitely a different person now as a result of doing that. So that kind of work can help a lot, and I've set stuff up in the hopper, as the case may be, for the next half year. So I'm going to be continuing to do this work to one degree or another, because I recognize that sustaining these kinds of changes takes time. Even doing 6 initiatory experiences in 4 months, it's a lot of work. I'm still going to need to maintain some of that work. There's an edge to it, and so that's what I'm doing. So that's shadow work. So what's inner alchemy then, you might be wondering? Okay, and I've talked a little bit about it, and I distinguished it from alchemy or laboratory alchemy. It can be a component in laboratory alchemy. It ideally is, but it also can be its own thing. So when we talk about inner alchemy, here's the approach that I'm going to talk about. Inner alchemy is embodied somatic practices that you use to cultivate the energy of your body. It may or may not involve working through and releasing some forms of internal blockages or internal tension and stress. And that can come in the forms of emotions and thoughts and things like that, but it's not necessarily the same thing. So it's really important to understand that and to recognize that is not necessarily that it's not necessarily shadow work. There's a very real difference there. So when I do Qigong each day, that would be a form of me doing inner alchemy, where I'm connecting with the chi, the ki of the environment around me, and I am working on transforming my relationship with it and my relationship with myself in order to create a different outcome for myself and who I am. This is really important because a lot of times when we're looking at this kind of work, we want to understand what it is that we're doing. So shadow work isn't necessarily part of that. And I mean, there have been years where I've done Taoist meditation where I have been able to dissolve and release some tension, and some emotions and trauma have come up, and I've been able to work through that as a result. But that's not the main focus. It's really about cultivation of chi, and the reason why we're releasing those blockages and all that is in order to cultivate that chi, cultivate that life energy, and be able to connect with the environment around us. So these are all relevant factors in this kind of work. When I go and I practice Kung Fu, for example, that's more external focus, but there's still a form of inner alchemical work going on, because I'm doing those practices in order to refine and focus my awareness and teach me those specific arts. Um, it's really important to understand that difference, because I think a lot of times people who go into like this idea of shadow work and inner alchemy, they conflate the two together, and it's like that's not the case at all. Inner alchemy and shadow work are not one and the same thing. Um, they are different, and I think it's really important to understand that, and to recognize that the purpose, for example, of inner alchemy is not necessarily to go and do like work around releasing your trauma and things like that. It's about cultivating your chi. It's about cultivating your internal energy, and there's a very real difference there, yeah, between that and doing that trauma informed work. If you're going to do that trauma informed work, again, I'm going to really strongly advocate that you don't do that on your own. And I'm going to say this from the weight of my own experience too. There were many years where I was doing a lot of internal work on myself, and I was doing it alone. Um, and I was trying to meditate my way through my trauma. I was trying to, white knuckle my way through all the issues that I had. And I'm not saying I didn't make some progress, but honestly, I would have done better if I'd had some other resources there. That if I'd gone to therapy, if I'd been part of a men's group. I didn't know about the men's movement at the time, and I don't know that I would have gotten into it even if I had known about it, because I didn't trust men. But my point being that if you're watching this and you're like, yeah, like I'm really trying to work on myself and everything, hey, congratulations, first of all. That's good. And secondly, reach out and get some help from someone that can help you on this journey, that can spot your blind spots, whether it's joining a support group, or it's talking to a therapist, or it's talking to a coach like me, or something else along those lines. Like, make sure that you get that help. That kind of journey isn't meant to be walked alone. It's a hard journey. You're going to do a lot of work on yourself, and you're going to need some accountability and some help along the way. I didn't do that for a long time, and part of that is just the societal programming around how men show up. We're supposed to be able to do all this stuff and never need another person. It doesn't work that way. That's the thing that I have learned time and time again, because when I look at the progress that I've made in the last almost 3 years now, no, 2.5, 2.5 years now of doing men's work, because I started in July of 2022. I started to get into this work, and I was doing it alone. Here's the kicker, though. I was doing it alone up until about this time of the year. So literally, I would say it's been 2 years now since I got into doing men's work with other people. And what I found is that I was down here, and then doing that work 10x'd it. And then, and those containers where I'm working with other people have made a significant amount of difference in our lives. In my life. But in the lives of other people that I've seen as well. That work isn't meant to be done alone. That's shadow work, and that work is meant to be done with other people. You're still going to do some of it on your own, because that's just kind of the nature of the beast, right? I mean, when I go and I do a weekend event, I'm going to come back out the other side, and I need to spend some time integrating. And the question I always have to ask myself, and it is a question I ask, is how do I take this moving forward? Great, I had a weekend event. I loosened up a bit. I broke through some stuff. And what's gonna stop me from having that stuff just freeze right back up? And that's one of the reasons why I did 6 initiatory experiences within a 4-month frame. Because I basically was essentially like, I'm not going to let this stuff freeze back up. I'm going to break through this. That was really intense work. I had a very specific idea as to where I wanted to go and be, and I'm continuing that journey. Like, that journey hasn't stopped. It's just that I've done a major breakthrough or release or whatever we want to call it. And I'm glad I have. But I couldn't have done that alone. When I compare that to the 18 years that I was doing internal work, doing Taoist dissolving meditations, doing some of the other practices that I was doing, I'm not saying that stuff didn't help. I made some changes in that time, but it took a lot longer. And I also have to acknowledge that it had an impact on the people around me at times. There were people in my life that were impacted by that. And I mean, in some ways I can say that one thing I can say is that I've come to realize too is that, I mean, I am not a person who's ever going to stay static. Like, I am doing the work that I do and the kind of the nature of who I am. I'm always changing and exploring, and people who can't keep up with it, that's not my problem. That's on them. And yet I can also recognize where there were times where the way I showed up had a detrimental effect because I was busy working through my stuff and I wasn't doing it in a way that was healthy for me or for the other people. So I acknowledge that, and I think it's an important thing to recognize that there is a very real difference between doing inner work on your own and doing it with other people. There's community there. There's strength and support and love and other key aspects that I think are absolutely necessary if we're going to do this work in a meaningful way. So if you're watching this and you're kind of like, hey, yeah, okay, fair enough, I buy your definitions of shadow work and all that and inner alchemy. I mean, the thing that I want you to really come away with is that shadow work and inner alchemy are not the same. Shadow work is great for doing that inner psychological work and working through the stuff, and it has some somatic effects and other things. I want to be very clear about that. And inner alchemy is something else altogether. It may or may not include doing inner work in that way. It's primarily intended for the cultivation of your life force and the refinement of it, and understanding that distinction and how that can also apply toward in magical work, because when you refine your life force and your energy, you're also refining your connection to the world around you, and it helps you to get better results. Understanding that distinction is key. So hopefully this video has helped answer that, and thank you for watching.